Bond is an icon who, after several decades and now approaching his centenary, has managed to survive the passage of time by constantly reinventing himself. From his origins in literature to conquering the silver screen and entering both classic and modern eras of gaming, Bond has remained one of the most recognizable characters in popular culture. But before he became the world's most famous spy, James Bond was simply an idea in the mind of one man. Ian Lancaster Fleming was born on May 28, 1908 in London, into a wealthy and influential family. His father was a member of the British Parliament, and the Flemings belonged to England's social elite. From an early age, Ian grew up surrounded by discipline, politics and privilege, but also by immense pressure. His older brother Peter was considered the family prodigy, while Ian was often seen as the rebellious one. He was expelled from schools and never quite fit the image of perfection that his family expected. However, his fascination with languages and the wider world led him to work as a journalist for Reuters, allowing him to travel across Europe during an increasingly tense period. The Second World War was approaching, and Fleming witnessed firsthand how espionage, politics, and covert operations were beginning to shape the world from the shadows. When the war began, Fleming joined British Naval Intelligence. He worked directly under Admiral John Godfrey, a figure many consider one of the primary inspirations for M. The personalities, skills, and experiences of the men Fleming encountered during this period would later help shape the character of James Bond. But it wasn't until after World War II, during the early years of the Cold War, that the image of the secret agent truly captured the public imagination. Every year, Fleming would retreat to Jamaica, and during one of those stays, while preparing for marriage, he sat down at his typewriter in a vacation home called GoldenEye, and began writing his first James Bond novel. He chose the name James Bond because it was simple, short, and unremarkable, borrowing it from the author of a bird encyclopedia. The famous code number 007 was inspired by the symbol used by John Dee, an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I during intelligence operations against Spain, and the plans of King Philip II's Armada. Casino Royale achieved moderate success, but as more novels followed, Bond's popularity steadily grew. The character received a major boost when US President John F. Kennedy listed from Russia with love among his favorite books. From that moment on, 007 became a global phenomenon. Although Casino Royale had already been adapted for television in 1954 as part of the Climax anthology series, producers Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman purchased the film rights to the Bond novels and founded Eon Productions with the goal of turning Fleming's stories into a major cinematic franchise. As preparations began for the first official Bond film, the producers searched for the perfect actor. They wanted British sophistication, charm and elegance, but also someone physically intimidating. Then came Sean Connery, a tall, rugged Scotsman with a background in bodybuilding. Connery brought an energy completely different from what Fleming had originally imagined. In fact, Fleming disliked the casting at first. In 1962, Dr. No premiered, and from the very beginning, many of the elements that would define the franchise were already in place. The gun barrel sequence, the Bond girls, the martini, and above all, the unforgettable introductions. The Aston Martin would arrive later in Goldfinger, but Connery's films became massive successes year after year until he eventually grew tired of the fame. You Only Live Twice was intended to be his farewell. In 1969, George Lazenby stepped into the role with On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Audiences, however, rejected the change, and by 1971, Sean Connery was persuaded to return for Diamonds Are Forever. Then, in 1973, Live and Let Die introduced Roger Moore as the new James Bond. The producers knew audiences adored Connery, so they took Bond in a completely different direction. The films became lighter, more humorous, and increasingly exaggerated. The franchise also embraced whatever trends were dominating popular culture at the time. When Bruce Lee films became a global sensation, The Man with the Golden Gun incorporated martial arts influences, and when Star Wars took the world by storm, Bond followed suit. Despite the end credits of The Spy Who Loved Me promising that James Bond would return in For Your Eyes Only, the producers instead made Moonraker and sent Bond into space. Sean Connery would later return one final time in Never Say Never Again, an unofficial Bond film that effectively pitted the original Bond against Roger Moore's version. By then, however, Moore himself was nearing the end of his tenure, and it was time for a new actor to take over. After Moore's eccentric adventures, Timothy Dalton brought Bond back to his literary roots. But action cinema in the 1980s was changing. Films like Scarface influenced audiences, and Bond entered a darker era. In License to Kill, for example, Bond abandons MI6 and pursues a personal vendetta against a drug lord. Then something unexpected happened. Legal disputes surrounding the Bond rights brought the franchise to a halt. For 6 years, no new Bond film was released. The age of spies was fading. The Cold War was ending. Action movies were moving in new directions with franchises like Mission Impossible, Terminator 2, The Matrix, and Total Recall. Then came Pierce Brosnan. Brosnan became perhaps the most Hollywood version of Bond ever seen. GoldenEye was his debut, and it also inspired a video game that changed gaming history forever. First-person shooters had traditionally been associated with PCs, but GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64 proved that consoles could deliver the same experience. Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough continued in a similar action-oriented direction. Die Another Day eventually closed Brosnan's era with questionable CGI, and they returned to the excesses and absurdity of earlier decades. That is precisely why the franchise was rebooted. For decades, despite the different actors, gadgets, villains, and storylines, all Bond films had existed within the same continuity. From Sean Connery to Pierce Brosnan, this was technically the same James Bond. The character needed a fresh start. As the 2000s began, Daniel Craig was chosen for the role, beating out contenders such as Sam Worthington and Henry Cavill, but Craig ultimately embodied exactly what the filmmakers wanted: the origin of James Bond. The internet exploded with criticism. Many fans complained simply because he was blonde and slightly shorter than previous actors. This turned out to be one of those rare moments when the fans were completely wrong. Director Martin Campbell paired Daniel Craig with Judi Dench, Eva Green, and one of the franchise's greatest villains, brilliantly portrayed by Mads Mikkelsen. The result was Casino Royale, my personal favorite Bond film. While it follows the events of Fleming's first novel, it is more than a straightforward adaptation. It is a transformation. Bond is rougher, more violent, less polished, and far less gentlemanly than the version audiences had known for decades. The opening sequence shows him earning his 00 status, while his confrontation with Le Chiffre pushes him to his limits. Combined with his relationship with Vesper Lind and her eventual death, the experience leaves a scar that defines his entire story arc. Only at the end of the film do we truly see him become James Bond. From that point forward, Craig's era introduced something entirely new to the franchise: continuity. For the first time, Bond films told an interconnected story that needed to be watched in order. Quantum of Solace continued Bond's obsession with avenging Vesper. Although the 2007 writer's strike negatively affected the script, the franchise would rebound in spectacular fashion with Skyfall in 2012. Directed by Sam Mendes and featuring stunning cinematography by Roger Deakins, Skyfall is widely regarded as one of the greatest Bond films ever made. For the first time in the franchise's history, Bond seemed to be confronting his own mortality. Javier Bardem Silva represented another agent discarded by the very system that created him. M, portrayed by Judi Dench since the Brosnan era, dies in the film, while younger versions of classic characters like Q and Moneypenny reinforce the idea that Bond is an old icon living in a changing world. Yet Skyfall makes one thing clear: old does not mean obsolete. Spectre attempted to connect Craig's storyline with much of Bond's classic mythology, but the result was more divisive. Finally, in 2021, No Time to Die delivered something many believed impossible: a definitive ending for James Bond. Bond dies, and the number 007 is left behind for the future, and that future would continue in another medium. Looking back, James Bond video games have always been full of surprises. While many titles were direct adaptations of the films, Electronic Arts acquired the license during the 2000s and produced fan favorites such as Nightfire, a sequel to Agent Under Fire that expanded on GoldenEye's first-person formula, with gadgets, vehicles, and large-scale action sequences. One particularly ambitious project was Everything or Nothing. Pierce Brosnan returned to provide both the voice and likeness of Bond, while familiar characters and Hollywood actors like Judi Dench and Willem Dafoe joined a production that felt almost like a full-fledged Bond movie. Following its success, EA developed a From Russia with Love adaptation that reimagined the classic story with a more action-oriented approach while still respecting the original. Most remarkably, Sean Connery returned decades later to lend his voice and appearance to Bond once again. Later, as Halo and Call of Duty dominated the gaming landscape, Quantum of Solace received a tie-in game heavily inspired by those shooters. Unfortunately, repetitive missions, unsatisfying gameplay, and weak boss encounters prevented it from standing out. The same happened with the GoldenEye remake. Rather than truly modernizing the original game, it often felt like a Call of Duty campaign dressed in GoldenEye's setting. Daniel Craig replaced Pierce Brosnan, and the final product felt strangely disconnected from both versions. Perhaps because of these disappointments, Bloodstone became one of the most underrated Bond games ever made, featuring an original Daniel Craig storyline designed specifically for the game. Unfortunately, Activision eventually lost the Bond license, and many years later, the developers of Hitman presented their project 007. They gave us First Light, with a new James Bond worthy of the best games in the franchise, with a modern appearance that tells us that no matter how old 007 gets, we will always remember his name.
Bond.
Bond.
Bond. Bond.
Bond. The name's Bond.
James Bond.